an empire. Dr. Philip Travis here, and I'm coming to you from Agrigento, Sicily. Behind me is the Temple of Concordia, one of the most impressive monuments of ancient Greece in the world. But it's not in Greece, it's in Sicily. This really beckons the question, was the ancient Athenian city-state an empire? In this video, I'm going to show you some sites from the Valley of the Temples, which contains a number of ruins from the ancient Greeks. We'll answer that question. Were the ancient Greeks an empire? Okay, so were the ancient Greeks of the classical age building an empire? I want to use this video to show us a few more of the sites from Agrigento, Sicily. The Greeks would have known this as Agrigos, which was one of the colonial settlements in Sicily. The Athenians had established a number of colonial settlements throughout the Mediterranean world, and they competed with other groups like the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians who laid the sort of foundation for the development of the Carthaginians, the empire that so rivaled and challenged Rome, culminating the Punic Wars. So should we think about this as an empire? And why is that an important thing to consider? The image you're looking at, by the way, is an image of the Temple Concordia, one of the most preserved Greek temples in the world. And these sites, these ruins, were constructed, the Greek temple parts of them at least. This is very much a site where there's much interconnection. So Sicily is a location for the interconnections of a myriad of peoples. And so there's the evidence of numerous different peoples coming here and leaving their mark on the archaeological record of the past. These sites, too, by the way, it should be noted that this set of ruins was constructed very much at the same time as many of the great ruins of the classical age of Greece. So these sites are very much associated with that same periodization, the classical age of Greece, which is the period of the 5th century, the 400s BCE, before Common Era. And this is the period of time in the classical age of Greece that is sort of nestled between the tumultuous Persian wars associated with famous battles like the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Salamis, particularly fought during the time period of the Persian Empire emperors Darius and Xerxes, particularly in the 490s and the 480s. The classical age of Greece generally is viewed to come to an end during the Peloponnesian Wars. And the Peloponnesian Wars was basically a period of civil war in Greece between the various city-states. Greece, of course, was made up of different competing city-states. The polis. Athens was a polis, Corinth was a polis, Thebes was a polis, and of course, Athens' number one competitor, historically, Sparta. And during the Peloponnesian War, of course, the Spartans led a number of the other city-states in a war against the Athenians, who, following the victory in the Persian Wars, had become very powerful, forming the Delaean League, and according to other city-states, was abusing its power. Well, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenians lost, but regardless, the Peloponnesian Wars really marks the demise of the classical age of Greece, a period of time that lasted maybe a century. And so the reason this is such a significant question is we must ask ourselves, if the ancient Athenians or the ancient Greeks during the classical age, if they didn't form an empire that like spread their ideas out, then how did these contributions, the ideas of the classical age of Greece, right? This is the period of time where drama is really sort of invented in the Western sense. The emergence of the first experiments with democracy, This is the period of time of great architectural revolutions. You're looking at a Doric cathedral or a Doric temple. This is a period of time of some of the most important works of philosophy, the works of Plato, of Socrates. A highly significant period of time, the emergence of comedy, the emergence even of the professional discipline of history, you could say, in a way, traces its long-term roots even to writers such as Herodotus and Thucydides, who wrote Herodotus about the Persian Wars, Thucydides about the Peloponnesian Wars. And that's just a few, along with ideas like, of course, the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors take to this day. These ideas as well emerged from classical Greece, ultimately, the influence of classical Greece. So, first of all, let's think about what an empire is. What is an empire? So the traditional definition of an empire, like a formal empire, is an interconnected geographical space comprising multiple peoples, cultures, countries, kingdoms, under a single authority. That's my definition here. So an empire is the creation of a large area of different peoples, different kingdoms, different cultures, right? Sort of controlled by one central authority, right? The first empire is usually regarded as the Akkadian Empire, which is the empire that ultimately supplanted Sumer and the Sumerians and created the Akkadian Empire in the region of Mesopotamia. Today, of course, empires, sometimes there are multiple definitions of this. Many American historians would use a term informal empire to describe the influence of the United States in the 20th century, as it, yes, took some areas directly under control, but had a sort of global reach and influence through channels that were informal. They weren't driven by direct control, shall we say. But in the traditional definition of empire would be this: an interconnected geographical space comprising multiple peoples, cultures, countries, and kingdoms under a single authority. Empires create what we might call a network sphere, because all of these different peoples are brought under one sort of controlling political and economic entity. And of course, it can come at a great deal of suffering and consequence for the environment and for the peoples and the animals of the world, as empires are typically brought about through military conquest of other people. But they create these networks where people, animals, plants, diseases, ideas are allowed and able to move more freely in a more of an interconnected zone, right? Perhaps down the line, the Roman Pax Romana, the Roman peace, perhaps is one of the best in the ancient period, one of the best examples of this type of an interconnected zone, allowing for, through the empire, a movement of goods, ideas, people, ideas, diseases, animals, and so forth. Of course, can come with very significant consequences as well to peoples, animals, and the environment. The map you're looking at is a map of areas that were colonized by the ancient Greeks. Now, were the ancient Greeks in establishing these colonies? And of course, in this area here, we see Carthage, who had a significant amount of Phoenician influence. The Phoenicians emerging from this region right here, great seafarers. The Phoenicians associated with the development of the phonetic alphabet. A highly significant people, and very much establishing the basis for the eventual emergence of the Carthaginian Empire right here, that would so vie with the Romans in the Punic Wars hundreds of years later. Ancient Greece during the classical age, though, it's really not an empire. The colonies that are established are largely, they're not, even though colonial locations, colonial cities did indeed expand into territories controlled by other peoples, The original efforts at colonization usually established themselves in places that were otherwise uninhabited. They weren't military adventures typically. Typically, they would have expanded into areas uninhabited. The people that would have come there and lived there and built cities there usually would have been relatively well-off people who had sold off lands, agricultural lands in their homeland, and used the equity, if you will, to establish themselves in these colonies. And some of the most significant of these colonies were in Sicily, of course, Syracusa, right here, and Gela, which is down here, and of course we're going to look at Agrigento, or Akragas, which is located right here in southern Sicily. So probably not fair to call them an empire. And we have to think about why, if it's not an empire, and you have this type of influence, how does this, beyond the classical age, beyond a period of, like I said, about a century, why are these ideas so significantly spread and transferred throughout the world with such long-term significance for the development in both Western civilization and in world history more generally? This is a look at the temple of Hera Lachina. Sometimes it's called Juno Lachina, but this is the same temple as Juno Lachina. Hera Lachina, this is a look up from the road that would be going down toward the temple Concord, as well as some other looks at this. Is a Doric temple here, and this temple was destroyed by the Carthaginians in 206 BCE. And actually, if you look closely at the columns, you can see that there's actually some archaeological evidence of the fire that would have burned this temple. And the Romans, of course, would later sort of replace the roof here of this temple from the old terracotta Greek roof that had existed prior to the expansion of Carthaginian influence into this region. The most famous of these temples is the Temple of Concordia, and this is a view of the very kind of picturesque view of the Temple of Concordia, viewing down from the Temple of Hera Lachina. And if you look at this, you can kind of see, you can kind of make out along this steep ridgeline, these areas here. What you're looking at here are actually the walls of the old Greek city. And this was a prosperous Greek city, and in many cases, the settlements, the colonial Greek settlements, in fact, in many cases, actually expanded beyond the proportions of the home states, the home cities that some of these individuals came from. And Akragas, or Agrigento, was a particularly impressive and thriving Greek city-state, a colonial state, during the classical age, which again, these temples are built at the same period of time, roughly, as those famous temples that we know from places like the Acropolis in Athens, like the Parthenon, for example. On your way down the road to the Temple Concordia, you walk right next to, and you can walk up on top of, if you so choose, the Greek walls that were built along the road. And along the road, there are early Christian burial tombs. And you know that these are these early Christian burial tombs because of these sort of archways, these arched sort of niches in the stone that are all along this road. And you can see back up here in the background, you can see the Temple of Hera Lachina here in the background. As you move down the road to the Temple Concordia, the most impressive of the ruins that you'll see at Agrigento. So the Temple Concordia, and this is a Doric temple. It's one of the most iconic of the Greek temples in the world today. One of the reasons for its preservation is because it was converted in the early Christian era. It was converted to a Christian temple, a Catholic temple. And it was dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul. And there's a structure which you can kind of see here on the inside of the columned areas that was built during that time period. So the development of this as a church meant that it was preserved more significantly than perhaps the other sites. This is, of course, an iconic Doric temple. And again, this is built in the middle of the classical age, same period of time as the temples on the Acropolis. And of course, the classical age is a period of about 100 years in the 400s BCE, was really associated with a thriving of Greek culture and civilization. The early Greek leaders here in Agrigento, they would have been known as tyrants. A tyrant in the Greek sense is typically understood as a leader that uses their influence and association with the masses to sort of to build power and make rather significant changes that might otherwise not be possible in the traditional limited representative democracy of ancient Greece. Today, tyrants, the term tyrant is used sort of in a myriad of ways. In ancient Greece, a tyrant was typically an individual that appealed to the masses, promised things to the masses, sought to deliver to the masses, and used that to sort of create a period of authority in which not only would a person hold on to power, but might also advance the state in ways that were unconventional, shall we say. Here you can see the Christian arches. These were created by the bishop. This was built during the time of the bishop of Agrigento during 579 AD, when the bishop Gregory converted this area to a Catholic church. Now, to why, though, we see these impressive monuments, why did Greek ideas have such an influence on the world? In a way, we could say that a big reason for this, the Greeks themselves, the Athenians, were not necessarily an empire, albeit the colonial states, the colonial cities, like, for example, Agrigento, they did wage war against the indigenous people. The indigenous people in Sicily, sometimes referred to as the Sicans or the Scythians, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they did expand into areas controlled by those people, but they weren't necessarily falling into that traditional formal definition of an empire. However, it was a non-Greek Alexander the Great, who is depicted here, by the way. This is on a floor mosaic from Pompeii. Pompeii, the city buried in rubble following the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Pompeii was, of course, a Roman city. However, the site of Pompeii, interestingly enough, was in fact originally a Greek colonial settlement. The theater in Pompeii was actually a Greek theater by design, and it was a colonial settlement of the Greeks and was influenced by the Carthaginians as well for a time before it became a Roman state. However, in the Roman state, you had, as we know, history is so important to understanding like who we are, both as a civilization broadly in human history, but also in terms of countries and kingdoms and societies. History is how we understand who we are. It's how we understand change over time. It's a very powerful tool to inform our decision making in the present if we dedicate ourselves to being a student to history and learning from the past. Well, in a similar way, Romans very much had an understanding of their history. And as a result of that, even though Alexander the Great is not a Roman, Romans understood the significance of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was from a place known as Pella, which is in Macedonia, which is up here in the north of the Greek regions. And the Greeks, the classical Greeks, would not have regarded these individuals as Greek. Like many civilizations at this time period, peoples of one group had a tendency to look down on peoples of the other. thinking themselves superior, and the Greeks were certainly no different than that. The Greeks had a very, very high-minded sense of themselves, and they viewed themselves as superior, and they defined the other, who was not part of their civilization, who spoke different languages, for example, as barbarians. And that term kind of came from a reference to the way they spoke. And so the Greeks, in a way, kind of really are innovators of that idea, that the othering of sort of barbarian groups. Well, Alexander the Great was a really critical figure. First of all, Alexander the Great, his father, Philip the Great, conquered what was left of the classical domains of Greece. This is some time after the Peloponnesian War. And in this process, there's influence already occurring between classical Greek thought and its transfer to other peoples. Alexander the Great, the son of Philip the Great, became a student of none other than the philosopher Aristotle. By the way, neither Aristotle or Plato, who was his teacher, so Socrates maybe didn't even exist, but Socrates would have been the teacher of Plato. If Socrates exists, we don't really know. Plato, it could have been that Socrates was sort of a made-up figure in the Platonic dialogues, which Plato wrote about Socrates. Socrates was the central character in those dialogues, each one seeking to convey a fundamental point about society. Okay? Well, Plato was Socrates' student, Aristotle was Plato's student. Aristotle and Plato disagreed on quite a few things, but both they had ideas about constitutional democracy, but neither really believed in true democracy. But nonetheless, Aristotle was actually Alexander the Great's student, and following his teaching of Alexander in Pella in Macedonia, Alexander went to Athens, formed his Lyceum, his famous school in Athens. And of course, Alexander the Great, through this influence, as well as other influence, became a true sort of student of Hellenistic thought. Hellenistic thought, a term broadly referring to Greek thought of the classical age. And so Alexander the Great, as I'm sure many of you know, launches massive conquest of the known world, establishing the most impressive empire of the age, and you can see it in the shaded colors. And in establishing the empire of Alexander the Great, and after his untimely death in Babylon in 323 BCE, in the 4th century, Alexander the Great's empire was broken up into a number of different imperial states. And these different imperial states continued to transfer and expand the ideas of Greek. So coming back around to where we started from, no, the ancient Greeks of the classical age they did not create an empire in the traditional sense. They established colonies, and those colonies, like at Agrigento, were very important. They were very important colonies. But ultimately, it was an empire of an individual in a group outside of Greece, but one that embraced the ideas of much of Greek thought, and then used these ideas to expand it throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. They built cities, they built infrastructure projects throughout the sort of known world. So in a way, empire facilitated the transfer of the ideas of Greek thought during the Hellenistic age, even though the classical Greeks who established places like Syracuse in Sicily, as well as Agrigento, which we've looked at, some of the impressive ruins left in Agrigento, though they themselves, the Athenians, were not themselves forming an empire in the formal sense. All right. I hope this is interesting and fascinating, and let me know any comments that you might have, and let's have a great week to everyone in my classes. If you're not in my classes, or if you are, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.